There is a quiet contradiction inside the human body. The same mind that once kept our ancestors alive by sensing danger and conserving energy now often misreads effort as failure and rest as weakness. Over long stretches of human history, survival did not depend on pushing to the edge every day, but on knowing when not to. Yet today, many people feel their limits too early in some moments and too late in others, as if the signal itself has become unreliable. If the boundary between what we can do and what we think we can do has shifted over time, then what exactly are we sensing when we say we have reached our limit? And why do humans misinterpret their own limits? Before we begin, please take a moment to like the video. The knowledge ahead will be worth it. There is a moment that feels familiar to almost everyone, a quiet point where the body seems to draw a line and say, "This is enough." It may appear while walking farther than usual, while carrying something heavier than expected, or even while trying to maintain focus on a task that slowly becomes more difficult to continue. The sensation often feels clear and convincing, as if it were a direct report from the body itself, something precise, something trustworthy. Yet when this moment is observed more carefully, it begins to reveal a different nature. What feels like a fixed boundary is not always a measurement of what the body can truly do, but a perception shaped by systems that were never designed to measure exact limits in the first place. Across most of human history, the body did not operate in environments where pushing to the absolute edge was useful or safe. Early humans lived in conditions where energy could not be easily restored, where food was uncertain, and where physical damage could not be quickly repaired. In such settings, survival depended less on reaching maximum capacity and more on avoiding unnecessary risk. Because of this, the internal signals that guide behavior evolved to act before true limits were reached, not at the moment of failure itself. The feeling of needing to stop, then, emerges not as a precise indicator of capacity, but as a protective suggestion shaped by long periods of uncertainty. If we imagine a human moving through a landscape where resources are scattered and unpredictable, every decision about effort carries weight beyond the immediate moment. Continuing for too long might mean arriving at the next day with less energy than needed, or increasing the chance of injury in an environment where recovery is slow. Under those conditions, it becomes more advantageous for the body to signal caution early rather than late. Over many generations, this pattern reinforces itself, creating a system where perceived limits appear before actual limits are reached. In the present, this inherited system continues to operate, even though many of the original conditions have changed. A person may feel that they can no longer continue an activity, only to find that after a brief pause or a small shift in attention, the capacity to continue returns. The body itself has not changed significantly in that short period of time, yet the perception of the limit has moved. This suggests that what was experienced as a boundary was not fixed, but adjustable, influenced by context, expectation, and internal evaluation. The signal was real, but its meaning was not absolute. When environments become more stable, with more predictable access to energy and lower immediate risks, the protective nature of these signals can begin to feel misleading. The body still acts as if uncertainty remains, producing sensations that encourage stopping even when the situation no longer requires it. This does not mean the signals are incorrect, but rather that they reflect a system calibrated for a different kind of world. If we follow this idea further, the concept of a limit begins to shift from something solid into something conditional. The same person, with the same body, may experience very different limits depending on time of day, surrounding conditions, or even subtle changes in attention. What once felt impossible can sometimes become manageable without any measurable change in physical structure. This pattern would have been familiar, though not consciously recognized, in early human life, where days varied in demand and recovery was uneven. The body could not rely on a fixed boundary, so it relied on flexible signals instead. Over long periods of evolution, flexibility offered a safer strategy than precision, and so the sensation of stopping became an early warning rather than a final verdict, a signal shaped not by exact capacity, but by the long memory of environments where being wrong in the direction of caution was less costly than being wrong in the direction of risk. If the feeling of reaching a limit is not a direct measurement, then the next question becomes quieter but more complex. What exactly is the body responding to when that feeling appears? The sensation does not emerge from a single place, and it does not depend on a single condition. It is the result of many small signals being combined, interpreted, and shaped into a single impression that feels simple, even though its origins are not. Breathing may become heavier, muscles may begin to feel strained, attention may drift, and the mind may start to anticipate discomfort before it fully arrives. None of these changes alone defines a true limit, yet together they create a pattern that the brain interprets as a point of stopping. This interpretation happens quickly and often without awareness, which is why the experience feels immediate and certain. However, when examined from a broader perspective, it becomes clear that the body is not reporting a boundary, but estimating a situation. Throughout human history, estimation was often more useful than precision. Early humans did not move through environments where exact calculations were possible. They moved through shifting conditions, where the ground, the weather, the availability of food, and the presence of danger could all change within a short period of time. In such a setting, the body could not rely on fixed thresholds. Instead, it relied on patterns, using past experience and current signals to predict what might happen if effort continued. This predictive process is central to how limits are perceived. When the body begins to send signals of fatigue or strain, the brain does not simply register them as they are. It places them into a context, asking, often unconsciously, what these signals might mean for what comes next. Will continuing lead to exhaustion that cannot be recovered quickly? Will it increase the risk of injury in a place where help is not available? Will it reduce the ability to respond to unexpected events later in the day? These questions are not asked in words, but they are built into the way signals are interpreted. As a result, the feeling of reaching a limit often reflects a prediction about the future, not a statement about the present. This is why the same physical condition can produce different experiences at different times. A person may feel unable to continue an activity in one moment, yet in another moment, under slightly different circumstances, continue much further without a clear change in the body itself. The difference lies in how the situation is evaluated. In environments where recovery is expected, where risk is low, or where motivation is high, the brain may interpret the same signals as manageable. In environments that feel uncertain, even if they are not truly dangerous, the same signals may be interpreted as a reason to stop. This variability can be traced back to the conditions under which the human body evolved. For most of human history, uncertainty was not occasional, it was constant. Food sources were not guaranteed, shelter was not always secure, and physical effort had to be balanced carefully against future needs. In that context, the cost of continuing too far could extend beyond the immediate moment, affecting survival over longer periods. Because of this, the system that interprets effort became tuned toward caution. It learned to respond not only to what is happening now, but to what might happen if current actions continue. This creates a situation where perceived limits are shaped as much by expectation as by physical state. The body and brain work together, not to find the edge of capacity, but to avoid approaching it too closely. In modern life, where many of these uncertainties are reduced or removed, the same system continues to operate. The signals still arise, the interpretations still occur, and the predictions are still made, even when the actual risks are different. As a result, the feeling of reaching a limit can appear in situations where the body is capable of continuing, not because the system is failing, but because it is doing exactly what it was shaped to do: estimate, predict, and protect, even when precision would seem more useful. If the sense of reaching a limit is shaped by interpretation and prediction, then it becomes possible to notice something else that is often overlooked. The timing of that feeling is not fixed. It does not arrive at the same point every time, even when the body is placed under similar demands. There are moments when the feeling appears early, almost unexpectedly, and other moments when it seems to stay distant, allowing effort to continue for longer than expected. This variability suggests that what we experience as a limit is not anchored to a single physical threshold, but influenced by a shifting internal evaluation that changes from one situation to another. In quiet ways, the body adjusts its signals depending on context, and those adjustments are often subtle enough that they pass without notice. If attention is focused, if the environment feels stable, or if the activity carries a sense of purpose, The same physical strain may be experienced differently than it would in a setting that feels uncertain or disconnected. The muscles do not suddenly gain new strength in these moments, yet the sense of what is possible expands, sometimes only slightly, sometimes more than expected. This does not mean that limits disappear, but it does suggest that the point at which they are perceived is not fixed in place. When this pattern is viewed through a longer historical lens, it begins to align with the conditions under which human perception developed. Early humans did not experience effort in controlled or repeated conditions. Each day presented different demands, different terrains, and different levels of available energy. Because of this, the body could not rely on a stable reference point for what constituted a limit. Instead, it had to remain flexible, adjusting its signals in response to changing circumstances. This flexibility was not a flaw, but a necessary adaptation to a world that did not offer consistency. A rigid system might have failed when conditions shifted, but a flexible one could adapt, even if it meant that signals were sometimes imprecise. Over time, this capacity for adjustment became part of how limits were perceived. The feeling of needing to stop began to reflect not only the current state of the body, but also the broader situation in which the body found itself. If resources were scarce, signals might appear earlier. If conditions felt more secure, those signals might be delayed. In both cases, the body was not measuring a fixed boundary, but responding to a changing set of conditions. In modern environments, where many variables are controlled or predictable, this same system continues to operate in the background. A person may wake with a sense of low capacity, only to find that later in the day, without any clear change in physical condition, the ability to continue has increased. On another day, the opposite may occur, with the feeling of limitation arriving sooner than expected. These shifts can seem inconsistent, but they follow a pattern that reflects the flexible nature of the system itself. The perception of limits moves because it was never designed to remain still. It was designed to adjust, to respond, and to anticipate, even when anticipation is no longer required in the same way. This creates a quiet distance between what the body can do and what it feels able to do at any given moment. The distance is not constant, and it does not follow a simple rule. It expands and contracts with context, shaped by factors that are not always visible. And within that shifting space, the idea of a personal limit becomes less like a fixed line and more like a moving boundary, one that changes with time, environment, and internal state. When this is understood, the feeling of reaching a limit begins to lose some of its finality. It remains meaningful, but it no longer stands as a clear endpoint. Instead, it becomes part of an ongoing process, one that reflects the long history of a body shaped to navigate uncertainty rather than define precise edges, leaving open a question that does not resolve easily. Where does the true boundary lie, when the signal that points to it is always in motion? Beneath the shifting feeling of limits, there is a quieter process taking place, one that does not aim to measure how much the body can truly do, but instead asks a different question. How much risk is acceptable in this moment? The brain is not a neutral observer of the body. It does not wait for damage to occur before sending a signal. Instead, it works ahead of time, combining small pieces of information into a single direction, often leaning toward caution rather than certainty. This is why the sense of reaching a limit can feel convincing, even when the body still has the capacity to continue. The signal is not built to reflect exact ability, but to reduce the chance of crossing into a state that might be difficult to recover from. If we look back across long stretches of human history, this approach begins to make sense. Early humans lived without consistent access to food, without reliable shelter, and without the kind of protection that modern environments now provide. A single injury, a small loss of energy, or a misjudged effort could carry consequences that extended far beyond the present moment. In such conditions, the brain did not need to know the exact edge of physical capacity. It only needed to ensure that the body stayed safely within it. Because of this, the systems that guide effort became oriented toward prediction rather than measurement. When signals from the body begin to change, when breathing becomes heavier or muscles begin to strain, the brain interprets these signals in relation to what might happen next. It asks, without words, whether continuing will create a situation that cannot be easily managed later. This predictive function is subtle, but it shapes the experience of limits in a consistent way. Instead of waiting until the body is truly exhausted or damaged, the brain sends a signal earlier, creating a sense of difficulty that encourages slowing down or stopping. From the outside, this can appear as an error, as if the body is underestimating what it can do. But within the context of uncertain environments, this early signal is not a mistake. It is a form of protection. Over time, this protective bias becomes part of how effort is experienced. The brain does not simply report what is happening in the body, it interprets and adjusts those signals based on past patterns and expected outcomes. This means that the feeling of effort is not fixed. It can be amplified or reduced depending on how the situation is perceived. If the environment feels unpredictable, if recovery seems uncertain, or if the consequences of failure appear significant, the brain may increase the sense of strain, even if the physical condition of the body remains the same. In this way, limits are shaped not only by biology, but by an ongoing process of evaluation that takes into account both present signals and possible futures. This process was shaped over long periods of time, when human survival depended on avoiding extremes rather than exploring them. The brain became a system that favors staying within safe margins, even when those margins are not clearly defined. In modern life, where many of the original risks are reduced, this same system continues to operate. The brain still interprets effort through the lens of caution, still sends signals that encourage stopping before reaching true capacity, and still prioritizes safety over precision. As a result, what we experience as a limit is often not a direct reflection of what the body can do, but the outcome of a protective process that was never designed to be exact, only to be effective in keeping the body within a range where recovery and continuation remain possible. If the brain operates as a system that predicts and protects, then it must rely on something more than the immediate signals coming from the body. It must draw from memory, from patterns formed over time, and from expectations that are often shaped long before a specific moment of effort begins. This means that the feeling of reaching a limit is influenced not only by what is happening now, but also by what the brain has learned to expect from similar situations. The body may be experiencing a certain level of strain, but the brain is already placing that strain into a broader context, comparing it to past experiences and projecting possible outcomes into the future. This process is not deliberate or conscious, yet it shapes the experience of effort in a consistent way. When a person begins an activity, the brain does not wait for clear signs of exhaustion before forming a judgment. It starts early, estimating how long the effort might need to continue, how much energy might be required, and what the consequences might be if the effort is sustained. These estimates are built from previous encounters with similar tasks, even if those encounters were different in subtle ways. Because of this, the brain often treats the present moment as part of a familiar pattern, even when the conditions are not exactly the same. If past experiences suggest that a certain level of effort leads to discomfort or difficulty, the brain may begin to signal caution earlier, shaping the perception of the current limit before the body has truly reached it. This tendency becomes easier to understand when viewed through the lens of early human environments. For most of human history, experiences were not isolated events. They formed patterns that could influence future behavior in meaningful ways. If a certain type of terrain, movement, or exertion had previously led to exhaustion or risk, it would be beneficial for the brain to recognize those patterns and respond sooner the next time they appeared. This does not require precise measurement, only a reliable association between certain signals and potential outcomes. Over time, these associations become part of how effort is interpreted. The brain learns to anticipate difficulty and to adjust the sense of strain accordingly. In this way, perception becomes partly shaped by memory, even when the current situation does not fully match the past. This can create a gap between what the body is capable of and what the mind expects it to be capable of. A person may feel limited not because the body has reached a true boundary, but because the brain is acting on an expectation formed under different conditions. In modern environments, where many variables are controlled and risks are reduced, these expectations may no longer align with reality. The body may have access to more stable energy, more predictable recovery, and fewer immediate dangers, yet the brain continues to interpret signals through patterns that were formed in less stable contexts. As a result, the sense of reaching a limit can be influenced by memories that no longer fully apply. The feeling remains convincing, because it is built on a system designed to favor caution, but its timing may not reflect the actual capacity of the body in the present moment. This does not mean that past experience is irrelevant. It remains an essential part of how the brain operates. But it does mean that the perception of limits is not a simple reading of the body. It is a constructed experience, shaped by signals, expectations, and learned patterns that extend back through time. When this is understood, the idea of a limit becomes less certain, not because the body lacks boundaries, but because the system that detects those boundaries is influenced by factors that are not always visible and not always aligned with the conditions of the present. If perception is shaped not only by immediate signals but also by memory and expectation, then the sense of a limit becomes something that is continuously adjusted, even while it is being experienced. The brain does not wait until the end of an effort to decide what is possible. It updates its estimate moment by moment, comparing what is happening now with what it anticipated would happen. When these two do not align, the feeling of effort can change in subtle ways. If the body is performing more easily than expected, the sense of strain may soften, allowing continuation. If the experience feels more difficult than predicted, the signal may intensify, encouraging a pause or a stop. This ongoing adjustment creates a fluid boundary, one that shifts in response to small differences that are often difficult to notice directly. From the outside, the body may appear to be doing the same thing, yet internally, the experience can vary because the comparison between expectation and reality has changed. This process reflects a deeper principle that has been present throughout human history. Early humans did not operate with fixed routines or predictable outcomes. Each movement, each search for food, and each period of rest unfolded in environments where outcomes were uncertain. In such conditions, it would not have been useful for the brain to rely on static rules. Instead, it needed to remain flexible, constantly updating its understanding of what was happening and what might follow. This flexibility allowed the body to respond to changing conditions without requiring precise knowledge of its absolute limits. The goal was not to find the edge, but to remain within a range that allowed continued survival over time. Because of this, the brain developed a way of interpreting effort that is dynamic rather than fixed. It continuously adjusts the sense of difficulty based on incoming signals and ongoing comparisons. When effort feels manageable, the boundary seems to move outward. When effort feels uncertain or risky, the boundary appears to move inward. This shifting process does not require conscious awareness, yet it shapes how limits are perceived in a consistent way. In modern environments, where many variables are more stable, this same system continues to function as if uncertainty was still present. A person may begin an activity with a certain expectation of difficulty, only to find that the experience changes as the activity continues. The body may adapt, or the mind may reinterpret the signals, leading to a different sense of what is possible. At times, this can create the impression that limits are unreliable, appearing and disappearing without a clear reason. However, when viewed through the lens of continuous adjustment, this pattern becomes more understandable. The brain is not attempting to provide a fixed answer. It is engaged in an ongoing process of estimation, shaped by both current signals and past experience. This means that the feeling of reaching a limit is not a single event, but part of a sequence of evaluations that unfold over time. The boundary is not discovered once and then held in place. It is revised repeatedly, sometimes within the same activity, sometimes across different days. When this is recognized, the concept of a personal limit begins to change. It is no longer a single point that can be identified with certainty, but a moving reference that reflects the interaction between the body, the brain, and the conditions in which they operate. And within that interaction, what feels like a clear endpoint may be only a temporary conclusion, one that could shift again as new information is received and interpreted, long before structured routines, measured meals, or predictable rest. Human life unfolded in environments where energy was uncertain, unevenly distributed, and often difficult to recover once lost. There were no fixed schedules that guaranteed replenishment, no reliable systems that ensured tomorrow would provide what today had taken away. In such conditions, the relationship between effort and survival was not immediate, but extended across time. A decision made in one moment could shape the ability to act in the next, and the next after that. Because of this, the body did not evolve to treat effort as a simple exchange, where energy spent would soon be restored. Instead, it learned to treat effort as a risk that had to be managed carefully, especially when the future could not be predicted with confidence. If we imagine early humans moving through a landscape where food sources were scattered and seasonal, the act of expending energy carried a quiet uncertainty. A successful search might provide enough for a short period, but it did not guarantee the next success. A failed search combined with excessive effort could reduce the body's ability to continue searching later. In this context, energy was not just something used, but something that had to be preserved across unknown intervals. This created a situation where the safest strategy was not to use energy fully, but to hold a margin in reserve. Over time, this margin became part of how effort was regulated. The body did not wait until it was empty before signaling the need to stop. It signaled earlier, creating a buffer that could protect against the unpredictability of what lay ahead. This pattern shaped the way limits were experienced. The feeling of reaching a boundary did not correspond to the complete use of available capacity, but to a point where continuing might begin to reduce future options. In other words, the limit was not defined by what the body could do in that moment, but by what it might need to do later. This forward-looking aspect of effort is easy to overlook in modern environments, where food is more accessible and recovery is more predictable. However, the system that interprets effort has not been redesigned to match these changes. It still carries the structure formed under conditions of uncertainty, where the cost of misjudging energy use could extend beyond a single day. Because of this, the brain often signals limits in a way that reflects not just the present demand, but an inherited expectation of future scarcity. This expectation does not require conscious awareness. It is built into the way signals are generated and interpreted. When effort begins to increase, the body does not simply track how much energy has been used. It begins to adjust the sense of difficulty in relation to what might be required later, even if that future demand is not clearly defined. This creates a situation where the feeling of fatigue can appear earlier than the body's true capacity would suggest, not because the system is inaccurate, but because it is cautious. The same pattern can be observed in how energy is distributed across time. A person may begin an activity with a certain level of capacity, yet feel the need to slow down before that capacity is fully used. This slowing is not necessarily a sign of weakness, but a reflection of a system that is attempting to balance present effort with uncertain future needs. In early human environments, this balance would have been essential. There were no guarantees of rest, no certainty of food, and no assurance that the body would have another opportunity to recover before being required to act again. Under those conditions, holding back was not a failure to reach a limit, but a way of extending the ability to continue over time. When viewed in this way, the modern experience of reaching a limit begins to take on a different meaning. The signal that appears as a boundary may not be pointing to exhaustion, but to a protective threshold that was shaped by a history of unpredictability. The body is not only responding to what is happening now, but to a pattern that assumes the future may demand more than the present reveals. And within that pattern, the sense of limitation becomes less about what is immediately possible and more about preserving the ability to continue in a world that, for most of human history, could not be trusted to provide what was needed next. In environments where energy could not be predicted, the problem was not only how much effort the body could produce, but how effort was distributed across time. There was no clear boundary between one task and the next, no defined period where energy could be fully spent and then restored without consequence. Instead, activity unfolded in sequences that were often interrupted, redirected, or extended by changing conditions. A search for food might take longer than expected, a path might require more movement than anticipated, or a period of rest might be shorter than needed. Because of this, the body could not treat effort as something that belonged only to the present moment. It had to be managed across an uncertain sequence of demands, where the next requirement was not clearly visible. This created a need for internal regulation that extended beyond immediate feedback. The body had to estimate not only how it felt now, but how it might need to function later. If too much energy was used early, there was no guarantee that enough would remain when it was needed again. If too little was used, opportunities might be missed. This balance did not require precise calculation, but it did require a system that could adjust effort in response to incomplete information. Over time, this need shaped how the sensation of effort was generated. Instead of reflecting a simple measure of physical capacity, the feeling of fatigue began to include an element of distribution, a sense of how much should be used now in relation to what might be needed later. This can be understood by imagining a situation where movement must continue for an unknown distance. If the endpoint is not visible, the safest strategy is not to move at maximum intensity, but to adopt a pace that allows continuation even if the path extends further than expected. The body does not need to know the exact distance to apply this strategy. It only needs to recognize that the distance is uncertain. In early human environments, this uncertainty was common. Landscapes did not provide clear signals about how long a task would take, and resources were not arranged in predictable ways. As a result, the body learned to regulate effort conservatively, favoring continuity over intensity. The feeling of reaching a limit, in this context, often marks a point where the current level of effort is no longer aligned with the need to sustain activity over time. It is not a signal that the body cannot continue at all, but that continuing at the same level may reduce the ability to continue later. This distinction is subtle, yet it has lasting effects on how limits are perceived. In modern settings, where many tasks have defined durations and predictable outcomes, this same regulatory pattern can appear out of place. A person may feel the need to slow down or stop, even when the endpoint is known and the available energy would be sufficient to reach it. The body, however, is not responding only to the known endpoint. It is responding to the deeper pattern of uncertainty that shaped its development. The internal system continues to assume that the path may extend beyond what is visible, and it adjusts the sense of effort accordingly. This can create a mismatch between the actual demands of the situation and the perceived need to conserve energy. The body is preparing for a future that may not exist in the same form, yet the signals remain consistent with a history where such preparation was necessary. This helps explain why limits can feel restrictive in situations where the risk of exhaustion is low. The system that generates those limits is not based solely on present conditions, but on a broader model of how effort should be managed when outcomes are uncertain. It does not wait for confirmation that energy will run out. It acts earlier, shaping behavior in a way that prioritizes the ability to continue over time. And within this framework, the sensation of reaching a limit becomes less about the end of capacity and more about the regulation of effort across an uncertain sequence, a process that was essential in early human life and continues to influence how limits are experienced today. What made this system even more influential was that uncertainty in early human life did not come only from food itself, but from the wider conditions that shaped whether food could be found, reached, carried, or safely used. Energy was never separate from landscape, weather, injury, distance, and the simple fact that the body had to survive inside a world that did not regularly match its needs. A person could move with strength in the morning and still arrive at evening with less security than expected, not because the body had failed, but because the environment had changed the meaning of that effort. Ground could become harder to cross, temperature could shift, other demands could appear, and what seemed manageable at one point in the day could become costly later. In this kind of world, the body was not adapting to one clear variable. It was adapting to layers of uncertainty that overlapped and reinforced one another. That matters because the feeling of a limit does not emerge from muscles alone. It also reflects the body's long relationship with unstable surroundings. If energy had once been spent in a world where tomorrow might offer less food, colder nights, longer movement, or unexpected danger, then the safest internal strategy was not to wait for obvious depletion. It was to create a margin before depletion arrived. Over long stretches of human history, such a margin would have protected more than immediate comfort. It would have protected mobility, judgment, recovery, and the ability to respond to changes that could not be predicted in advance. When viewed this way, the sensation of reaching a limit begins to look less like an error and more like a survival habit carried forward into modern life. The body is not simply reacting to present effort. It is acting through a system shaped in conditions where effort always had to remain connected to unknown future demands. This also helps explain why the same activity can feel different depending on the wider setting around it. A movement performed in calm and predictable conditions may feel sustainable, while that same movement in a less stable context may feel heavier and shorter, even if the body itself has not changed in any measurable way. The difference lies in how the whole situation is being read. Early human environments required exactly this kind of reading. A body that ignored surrounding instability and focused only on present strength would have risked spending too much in the wrong moment. A body that responded early, conserving part of its capacity, would have been better prepared for what came next, even if that caution sometimes appeared excessive. In the modern world, many people live with far more predictable access to food, shelter, and recovery than their ancestors ever did. Yet the deeper structure of effort perception remains influenced by that older pattern. The body still tends to treat continuation as something that must be protected across time, not merely completed in the present. This is why a person may feel a limit long before any true biological edge has been reached. The signal is not lying, but it is speaking in an older language, one shaped by landscapes where certainty was rare and where the cost of using too much too soon could extend beyond a single hour or a single day. In that sense, humans often misinterpret their own limits because they assume the feeling of stopping belongs entirely to the body they have now, in the world they live in now. But part of that feeling belongs to a much older world, one in which energy was guarded not because the body was weak, but because the future remained unclear, and survival often depended on preserving more than the present seemed to require. When the body signals a need to slow down or stop, it is easy to assume that something has been reached, a boundary, a limit, a point beyond which continuation is no longer possible. But in the conditions where this signaling system was shaped, reaching such a point was not the goal, avoiding it was. In early human environments, the difference between stopping before a limit and reaching it directly could carry consequences that extended far beyond the immediate moment. A body that pushed too far might not only become tired, but less able to move effectively the next day, slower to react, or more vulnerable to injury in a setting where even small setbacks could accumulate. Because of this, stopping early was not a failure to reach capacity, but a way of protecting the ability to continue across time. This idea changes the meaning of limits in a quiet but important way. Instead of representing the edge of what the body can do, limits begin to represent a buffer, a space created to reduce risk in an uncertain world. If we imagine a person moving through a landscape without knowing how long the journey will last, the safest approach is not to use all available strength at once, but to preserve a portion of it for what might come next. The body does not need exact information to apply this strategy. It only needs to recognize that the future is not fully predictable. Over long periods of human history, this lack of predictability was not an exception, but a constant condition. Food might not be found when expected, shelter might not be secure, and the distance between one moment of effort and the next opportunity for rest could vary in ways that could not be planned in advance. In such an environment, the cost of using too much energy at the wrong time could not always be corrected later. Recovery was not guaranteed, and the ability to act in the following hours or days could depend on decisions made much earlier. Because of this, the body developed a tendency to create a margin, to signal the need to stop before reaching full exhaustion. This margin acted as a form of protection, not only for the present, but for the continuity of activity over time. It allowed the body to remain capable, even when conditions shifted in ways that could not be predicted. When viewed from this perspective, the sensation of reaching a limit is not pointing directly to the end of capacity. It is pointing to the edge of a chosen buffer, a space where the body begins to reduce risk rather than explore maximum output. In modern environments, where many forms of uncertainty have been reduced, this same system continues to operate. A person may feel the need to stop during an activity, even when the endpoint is known and the available energy would be sufficient to reach it. The body, however, is not responding only to the known conditions of the present. It is responding to a deeper pattern, one shaped in environments where endpoints were rarely clear and where future demands could not be ignored. This creates a situation where stopping early can feel unnecessary or even limiting, as if the body is holding back without reason. Yet within the context of its evolutionary history, this behavior follows a consistent logic. The body is not designed to discover how far it can go in a single moment. It is designed to remain functional across many moments, even when those moments cannot be fully predicted. This means that what we experience as a limit is often the beginning of a protective process, not the conclusion of ability. The signal appears early because it was meant to, guiding behavior in a way that favors continuity over completion. And within that guidance, stopping before reaching a true limit becomes not a mistake, but a pattern that once supported survival in a world where using everything at once could leave nothing for what came next. This tendency to stop before reaching a true physical boundary becomes even more visible when effort is observed across longer periods of time rather than within a single moment. The body does not experience activity as isolated events. It experiences sequences, where one period of effort is always connected to what came before and what may follow after. In early human life, these sequences were rarely predictable. A period of movement could extend into unexpected terrain. A search for food could last longer than anticipated, and a moment of rest could be shortened by changing conditions. Because of this, the body learned to treat every effort as part of a larger continuum, rather than as a task with a clear beginning and end. Within such a continuum, using all available capacity at once would not have been efficient. It could create a situation where the body was fully capable in one moment, but less capable when the next demand arrived. This is why the sensation of stopping often appears not at the point of maximum ability, but at the point where continuing might begin to reduce flexibility for what comes next. If we imagine a person moving through an environment where the distance to the next resource is unknown, the safest strategy is not to move as fast or as hard as possible, but to maintain a level of effort that allows adjustment if conditions change. The body does not need precise knowledge of what lies ahead to apply this strategy. It only needs to assume that the path may extend further than expected. Over long stretches of human history, this assumption would have been valid in many situations. Landscapes did not provide clear signals about how far one needed to go, and resources were not arranged in predictable patterns. As a result, the body developed a way of regulating effort that favors continuity over intensity. The feeling of reaching a limit, in this context, often signals that the current level of effort is no longer aligned with the need to remain adaptable over time. It is not a statement that the body cannot continue at all, but a suggestion that continuing in the same way may reduce the ability to respond to future demands. This distinction becomes clearer when considering how recovery functioned in early human environments. Recovery was not guaranteed, and it was not always immediate. After a period of high effort, the body might not have access to sufficient food or rest to restore what had been used. This meant that each decision about effort had to account not only for the present moment, but for the possibility that recovery would be delayed or incomplete. Under such conditions, stopping early could preserve a level of function that would remain available even if recovery did not occur as expected. Over time, this pattern became embedded in the way effort is perceived. The brain does not simply track how much energy has been used, it also evaluates how much should be preserved, given the uncertainty of recovery. This creates a protective margin that appears as a limit, even when the body still has the capacity to continue. In modern environments, where recovery is often more predictable and resources are more accessible, this same margin can feel unnecessary. A person may feel the urge to stop during an activity, even when there is no real risk in continuing. The body, however, is not responding only to the present conditions. It is responding to a deeper pattern shaped in environments where recovery could not be assumed. The signal to stop reflects an inherited caution, one that prioritizes maintaining function over fully using capacity. This is why the experience of limits can feel restrictive, as if the body is holding back without a clear reason. Yet from the perspective of its evolutionary history, this behavior follows a consistent logic. The body is not designed to reach the edge of its ability in every moment. It is designed to remain capable across a series of moments, even when those moments cannot be fully predicted. And within that design, stopping before reaching a true limit becomes a way of preserving continuity, a pattern that once supported survival in uncertain environments and continues to shape how limits are experienced today, even when the conditions that created that pattern are no longer present. There is another layer to this pattern that becomes visible when effort is not only considered across time, but across repeated experiences. The body does not encounter effort as something entirely new each time. It carries forward traces of previous effort, not in the form of exact measurements, but as adjustments in how signals are generated and interpreted. When an action is repeated, even under slightly different conditions, the system that regulates effort begins to anticipate what that action might require. This anticipation does not aim for precision. It aims for safety across repetition. If an activity has previously led to strain, discomfort, or delayed recovery, the brain may begin to adjust the perception of effort earlier the next time it appears. This means that the sense of reaching a limit can gradually shift forward in time, appearing sooner, not because the body has become weaker, but because the system is attempting to reduce the likelihood of repeating a costly outcome. In early human environments, this kind of adjustment would have been essential. Repeated exposure to similar demands could carry cumulative risk. A path that required difficult movement one day might become more dangerous if the body entered it already fatigued from previous effort. A sequence of days with limited food could make even moderate exertion more costly. Because of this, the body did not treat each effort as independent. It treated effort as something that accumulated across time, and it adjusted its signals accordingly. The feeling of a limit then begins to reflect not only the present state of the body, but also the history of recent effort, and the expectation of what that history might lead to if continued. This creates a pattern where limits are not fixed, but shaped by repetition. A person may notice that an activity feels more difficult on one day than on another, even when the external conditions appear similar. The difference lies in how the body has integrated previous experiences into its current evaluation. If recent effort has been high, the system may signal caution earlier. If recent effort has been low, the same activity may feel more accessible. This adjustment happens quietly, without clear markers, yet it influences how limits are perceived in a consistent way. In modern environments where tasks are often repeated under controlled conditions, this pattern can still be observed. A person may approach the same activity on different days with different expectations shaped by how it felt before. If the memory of difficulty is strong, the sense of effort may rise earlier, narrowing the perceived limit. If the memory of ease is present, the same activity may feel more open, allowing the perceived limit to extend. These changes do not necessarily reflect immediate changes in the body's physical capacity. They reflect adjustments in how the brain is preparing for what it believes is likely to happen. Over long periods of evolution, this kind of preparation would have helped reduce the accumulation of risk. By signaling earlier in situations that had previously been costly, the body could avoid entering states that were difficult to recover from. This does not require an exact record of past events. It only requires a general pattern, a sense of whether similar efforts have led to outcomes that should be approached with caution. As a result, the perception of limits becomes tied to repetition, shaped by what has happened before as much as by what is happening now. When this is understood, the idea of a limit becomes even less stable. It is not only influenced by current signals and future expectations, but also by the memory of past effort, layered over time. And within this layered process, the feeling of stopping begins to reflect a system that is not simply detecting a boundary, but actively adjusting that boundary based on experience, often shifting it earlier in order to maintain a margin of safety across repeated demands, even when the present moment might allow for more than the signal suggests. Between what the body can do and what the mind feels it can do, there is often a quiet gap, and much of human confusion about limits begins there. This gap is not always dramatic. In many cases, it appears as a small but persistent mismatch between capacity and experience. A person may still be physically able to continue walking, lifting, or concentrating, yet the effort already feels too large, too heavy, or too costly to maintain. What matters here is that the feeling of effort is not identical to the body's actual remaining ability. The two are related, but they are not the same thing. One belongs more to direct physical capacity, while the other belongs to interpretation, prediction, and internal regulation. When these two are mistaken for each other, the sensation of effort begins to look like proof of a hard boundary, even when it may only be reflecting a protective estimate. This distinction becomes easier to understand when we remember that the human body did not evolve in settings where exact output had to be measured with precision. Early humans lived in environments where the value of effort depended on context. The same exertion could be manageable on one day and costly on another, depending on food availability, temperature, terrain, injury, or the demands that might follow later. In such conditions, it would not have been useful for the brain to generate a perfectly objective sense of effort. What was more useful was a flexible signal that could rise or fall depending on circumstances, helping the body avoid overuse when the future was uncertain. Because of this, perceived effort became a kind of internal warning, not a strict measure of what muscles, lungs, or attention were still able to produce. If we imagine a person crossing uneven ground with limited food already behind them and no guarantee of easy recovery ahead, the body does not need to calculate exact remaining capacity in order to protect itself. It only needs to make continuation feel more costly before true danger arrives. Over long periods of human history, this would have been adaptive. A signal that came early could preserve enough strength for unexpected demands later in the day. A signal that came too late might leave the body exposed at the worst moment. This helps explain why effort can feel overwhelming even before actual capacity is close to exhaustion. The body is not lying, but it is speaking in a language shaped more by caution than by exact measurement. In modern life, this gap between capacity and perceived effort often becomes more noticeable because many situations no longer resemble the unstable conditions in which the system developed. A person may have access to food, rest, and safety, yet the sense of effort still rises early, as though the body were preparing for scarcity or uncertain recovery. This can make ordinary tasks feel like firm encounters with limitation when, in reality, the body may still hold a considerable reserve. At the same time, the opposite can also happen. Under certain conditions, strong motivation, stable surroundings, or narrowed attention can make effort feel lighter than expected, temporarily reducing the gap and allowing more output than seemed possible at first. Both patterns reveal the same thing. Effort is not a direct mirror of capacity. It is a moving interpretation of capacity, shaped by context and by the long history of a species that survived better by holding something back than by using everything at once. And once that is understood, the feeling of "this is all I have" becomes less absolute, because the body's true ability and the mind's immediate reading of that ability are not perfectly joined, but separated by a small evolutionary distance that humans still misread today. What makes this gap even more difficult to notice is that perceived effort often feels immediate and undeniable, while actual capacity remains partly hidden until much later. A person does not usually experience the body as a set of measurable reserves. What is experienced directly is the rising weight of continuation, the sense that each next step, each next minute, or each next act of focus is becoming more expensive. Because that feeling is so vivid, it is easy to treat it as a full report on reality. But in many cases, it is closer to a forecast than a measurement. It reflects how costly the brain believes continued effort may become, not simply how much ability remains in the body at that exact moment. This is one reason humans so often confuse the sensation of increasing difficulty with the fact of nearing an absolute limit. The two can overlap, but they are not identical. In early human environments, this difference would have mattered greatly. The body was not living inside systems that guaranteed quick recovery, stable nutrition, or predictable shelter. A difficult stretch of movement did not end when the immediate task ended, because the effects of that effort could continue into the next search, the next cold period, or the next day without adequate food. Under such conditions, it would have been adaptive for perceived effort to rise in advance, making the present task feel heavier before the body had actually reached its final usable capacity. That rising feeling would help reduce the risk of entering a state from which recovery might be slow or uncertain. In this way, the sensation of effort became linked not only to present strain, but to the possible cost of continuing beyond what the future could safely support. This is why the gap between capacity and perceived effort can be so persistent. The body may still be capable of more, while the mind is already receiving a signal shaped by caution. If we imagine an early human carrying gathered materials across uneven ground near the end of the day, the body would not need to wait for true collapse before reducing the desire to continue at the same intensity. It would be safer for effort to begin feeling heavier sooner, preserving some margin for whatever conditions followed. That margin may have meant the difference between arriving somewhere with enough strength still available or arriving with too little left to respond if something changed. In modern settings, where many tasks are shorter, recovery is easier, and energy is more accessible, the same protective pattern can make the gap feel confusing. A person may stop not because the body has no more to give, but because the experience of giving more has already become unpleasant enough to be interpreted as a limit. The unpleasantness is real, but it does not always reveal the true boundary of ability. At the same time, when context changes, when attention narrows, when the endpoint becomes clearer, or when the environment feels safer, the same body may suddenly seem able to continue further. The physical capacity did not appear from nowhere. It was already present, but the earlier interpretation had made it feel less available. This is the quiet separation at the center of human misjudgment. We tend to believe that what effort feels like tells us exactly what the body can do. Yet for most of human history, what mattered was not exactness, but protection. And so the feeling of effort became a cautious guide, one that often speaks before the body's full capacity has actually been reached, leaving humans to mistake a warning for a final truth. This gap between what the body can do and what effort feels like becomes even more complex when attention is directed inward for longer periods of time. The more closely a person monitors their own sensations, the more detailed those sensations become, and the more influence they begin to have on the perception of limits. Small changes in breathing, slight increases in muscle tension, or subtle shifts in discomfort that might otherwise pass unnoticed, can grow more prominent when they are observed directly. As these signals become more noticeable, the sense of effort can appear to rise faster, even if the underlying physical state of the body has not changed significantly. This creates a situation where attention itself begins to shape the experience of limits, not by altering the body's capacity, but by altering how that capacity is interpreted in the moment. In early human environments, attention was rarely focused inward in this sustained way. It was directed outward, toward movement, navigation, the search for resources, and the detection of changes in the surrounding environment. The body was active within a landscape that required constant engagement with external conditions, and internal sensations were only one part of a larger field of awareness. Because of this, the signals that indicated rising effort were present, but they were not always the center of attention. They functioned as background guidance rather than dominant experiences. Over long periods of time, this outward orientation would have helped maintain a balance between sensing effort and continuing necessary activity. The body could adjust its behavior without becoming fully absorbed in the sensation of strain. In modern settings, however, many activities involve sustained inward attention, whether through repetition, controlled environments, or the absence of immediate external demands. In these conditions, the mind can begin to focus more closely on internal signals, amplifying their presence. As attention settles on the feeling of effort, the interpretation of that effort can shift. What might have been experienced as manageable becomes more difficult, not because the body has lost capacity, but because the signal has become more prominent in awareness. This amplification can narrow the perceived gap between effort and limit, making it feel as though the boundary has been reached sooner than it actually has. At the same time, the opposite pattern can also occur. When attention is directed outward, toward a task, a path, or a changing environment, internal signals may recede slightly, allowing effort to continue with less perceived strain. The body does not suddenly gain new capacity in these moments. Instead, the interpretation of its signals changes, widening the gap between what is felt and what is possible. This dynamic can be traced back to the way human perception evolved in environments that required constant interaction with the external world. Attention was not meant to remain fixed on internal sensations for extended periods. It was meant to move, to shift, and to integrate multiple sources of information at once. When this natural movement of attention is reduced, the balance between signal and interpretation can change, influencing how limits are experienced. Over long stretches of human history, this balance would have supported survival by allowing effort to be regulated without overwhelming awareness. The body could signal caution without turning that signal into a dominant experience that stopped action prematurely. In modern contexts, where attention can remain fixed on the body itself, this balance can shift, making the sensation of effort feel more immediate and more absolute than it might otherwise be. This does not mean that the feeling is incorrect, but it does mean that it is shaped by how it is observed. The gap between capacity and perceived effort remains, but attention can either narrow or widen that gap, changing the point at which a limit appears to be reached. And within this shifting relationship, humans often interpret what they feel as a direct reflection of what is possible, even though that feeling is being quietly shaped not only by the body, but by where and how attention is placed in the moment. Among the many signals that shape the feeling of a limit, pain and discomfort often appear as the most convincing. When they arise, they carry a sense of urgency that is difficult to ignore, a sharp sensation in the muscles, a growing heaviness in the body, or a steady discomfort that builds with continued effort, can all feel like clear evidence that something has reached its end. Yet these signals, while real, do not always indicate that the body is at risk of immediate harm. They are part of a broader system designed to guide behavior, not to provide exact measurements of structural damage or true capacity. Pain and discomfort function as warnings, but like all warnings, they are shaped by the conditions under which they developed. In early human environments, where injury could not be easily treated and recovery could take a long time, it would have been safer for the body to signal caution before actual damage occurred. A system that waited until tissues were already compromised would have been too slow to prevent further harm. Because of this, the body evolved to produce signals that often appear in advance of real danger, creating a margin that encourages adjustment before the situation becomes critical. This means that the presence of pain or discomfort does not always correspond to a true limit, but to a point where the body is advising caution based on patterns that were once necessary for survival. If we imagine a person moving through uneven terrain, the sensation of strain in the legs or a sharp signal from a joint does not need to reflect immediate injury in order to be useful. It only needs to prompt a change in behavior that reduces the likelihood of injury occurring. Over time, this kind of early signaling becomes embedded in how the body communicates with the mind. The signals are experienced as direct and convincing, yet their purpose is not to define the exact boundary of what the body can tolerate. It is to shift behavior away from potential risk. In modern environments, where many movements take place under more controlled conditions, this same system continues to operate with similar intensity. A person may feel discomfort during an activity that does not pose a real threat to the body, yet the signal can still feel like a clear instruction to stop. This can create confusion because the experience of the signal is strong, while the actual level of risk may be low. At the same time, there are situations where discomfort can be present without leading to harm, and others where harm can occur with relatively little immediate discomfort. This variation reflects the fact that pain and discomfort are not direct indicators of damage, but interpretations shaped by the brain in response to multiple factors, including past experience, current context, and expectations about what might happen next. Throughout human history, these signals would have been calibrated in environments where the cost of ignoring them could be high. A small injury could limit movement, reduce access to resources, and increase vulnerability over time. Because of this, it was safer for the system to produce signals that erred on the side of caution, even if that meant stopping earlier than necessary in some situations. This protective bias remains present today. The body continues to generate sensations that encourage early adjustment, even when the conditions no longer require the same level of caution. As a result, pain and discomfort can be misinterpreted as definitive limits, when in fact they may be part of a broader guidance system that operates with a margin of safety built into it. Understanding this distinction does not remove the importance of these signals, but it does change how they are interpreted. They are not final statements about what the body can or cannot do. They are messages shaped by a long history of protecting the body from uncertain risk, and within that history, they often appear earlier than the true boundary they seem to represent. When discomfort appears, it rarely arrives alone. It is accompanied by interpretation, shaped by how the brain organizes and gives meaning to what is being felt. A sensation in the body does not carry a fixed meaning on its own. The same physical signal can be experienced as manageable in one moment and overwhelming in another, depending on how it is understood within a broader context. This is because pain and discomfort are not simply signals sent from the body to the mind. They are constructed experiences, formed through the interaction between sensory input and the brain's ongoing attempt to predict what those signals might imply. In early human environments, this process of interpretation would have been essential. The body was exposed to a wide range of conditions, some of which required immediate withdrawal, and others that could be endured without long-term harm. The brain needed a way to distinguish between these possibilities, not with perfect accuracy, but with enough caution to reduce risk. Because of this, the meaning of discomfort became flexible. It could be amplified when the situation appeared uncertain or potentially dangerous, and reduced when the same sensation occurred in a context that felt more predictable or controlled. Over time, this flexibility allowed the body to adapt its responses without requiring exact measurements of damage or capacity. The brain could adjust the intensity of the experience itself, shaping how strongly a signal was felt in order to guide behavior. This helps explain why discomfort can feel different depending on the surrounding conditions. A sensation that arises during a familiar and stable activity may feel less threatening than the same sensation in an unfamiliar or unpredictable setting. The body does not change in a fundamental way between these moments, but the interpretation of the signal shifts. In modern environments where many sources of uncertainty have been reduced, this interpretive system continues to operate. A person may experience discomfort during an activity and immediately associate it with the need to stop, even when the actual level of risk is low. The strength of this association comes from a system that was shaped in contexts where erring on the side of caution was often beneficial. The brain does not wait for clear evidence of harm. It acts on patterns, using available information to produce a response that favors protection. At the same time, there are situations where discomfort is present but interpreted differently, allowing continuation despite the signal. This can occur when the environment feels controlled, when the outcome is predictable, or when attention is directed in a way that reduces the perceived threat of the sensation. In these cases, the same underlying signals are present, but their meaning is adjusted, leading to a different experience of effort and limit. This variation reveals an important aspect of how limits are perceived. The boundary is not determined solely by the intensity of physical signals, but by how those signals are interpreted within a given context. The brain does not provide a simple reading of the body. It constructs an experience that reflects both the signal itself and the conditions in which that signal is received. Throughout human history, this approach would have supported survival by allowing flexible responses to a wide range of situations. The body could withdraw quickly when necessary and continue when conditions allowed, even if the signals themselves were similar. In the present, this same flexibility can lead to confusion, as the meaning of discomfort shifts in ways that are not always obvious. A person may interpret a sensation as a firm limit in one moment and as a manageable part of effort in another, without a clear change in the body's actual state. This does not mean that the signals are unreliable, but that their meaning is not fixed. They are shaped by interpretation, and that interpretation carries the influence of a long history in which the safest response was often to treat discomfort as a reason to pause, even when the true boundary of the body remained further away. There are also moments when pain and discomfort do not behave in the way people expect them to. Sometimes they appear early and strongly, even when the body is not in immediate danger, and at other times they remain quiet or distant, even when the body is approaching a more serious state. This inconsistency can be difficult to understand if pain is assumed to be a direct signal of damage, but when it is viewed as part of a protective system shaped by prediction and caution, the pattern begins to make more sense. The brain does not wait for clear evidence of harm before producing a signal. It acts in advance, using available information to estimate whether continuing might increase the likelihood of harm. In doing so, it may produce strong sensations even when the actual risk is still low, simply because the situation resembles something that could become harmful if not adjusted early. In early human environments, this tendency would have been valuable. The body often operated in conditions where feedback about damage came too late to be useful. A small strain that went unnoticed could develop into a more serious problem that limited movement, reduced access to resources, or increased vulnerability over time. Because of this, the system that generated pain and discomfort was biased toward early warning. It did not aim to be perfectly accurate in identifying damage. It aimed to prevent situations where damage might occur without sufficient time to respond. This means that pain can sometimes appear as a precaution rather than as a reflection of current injury. The sensation is real, but its purpose is to guide behavior before a threshold is crossed, not to confirm that the threshold has already been reached. At the same time, there are situations where the opposite pattern emerges, where discomfort is reduced or delayed even when the body is under significant strain. This can happen when attention is focused elsewhere, when the environment feels stable, or when the situation is interpreted as manageable. In these moments, the brain may reduce the intensity of the signal, allowing continuation despite the presence of physical stress. This does not mean that the body is free from limits, but that the perception of those limits is being adjusted in response to context. Throughout human history, this flexibility would have allowed the body to remain responsive in a wide range of conditions. It could increase caution when uncertainty was high, and reduce it when continuation was necessary. However, this flexibility also means that pain and discomfort cannot be treated as simple indicators of where a true limit lies. They are part of a system that balances protection with continuation, and that balance shifts depending on how the situation is understood. In modern environments, where many risks are reduced and feedback is more immediate, this system can feel inconsistent. A person may experience strong discomfort during a task that carries little real danger, while in other situations, significant strain may be tolerated without immediate warning. This variation can lead to confusion, because the intensity of the sensation does not always match the actual level of risk or the true boundary of the body's capacity. Yet from an evolutionary perspective, this pattern follows a consistent logic. The system is not designed to provide precise information about damage. It is designed to reduce the likelihood of entering a state that would be difficult to recover from. And because uncertainty was a constant feature of early human life, the safest approach was to produce signals that often arrived early and sometimes varied in intensity depending on context. When these signals are interpreted as exact measures of limit, they can be misleading. They may suggest that the body has reached its edge when it has not, or fail to signal clearly when that edge is closer than expected. Within this complexity, the experience of pain becomes part of the larger question, not a clear answer. It reflects a system that protects by anticipating, adjusting, and sometimes exaggerating, leaving humans to interpret sensations that were never meant to define a precise boundary, but only to guide behavior in a world where certainty was rarely available. The sense of a limit does not form in isolation. It is shaped not only by the body and the brain, but also by the presence of other people. From very early in human life, individuals do not learn what is possible only through direct experience. They observe, compare, and adjust based on what others around them appear to do, tolerate, or avoid. This means that the perception of limits becomes partly social, influenced by patterns that are shared within a group rather than discovered independently. When a person sees others stop at a certain point, slow down under certain conditions, or avoid particular forms of effort, these behaviors begin to define what seems reasonable or expected. Over time, these shared expectations can become internalized, shaping how effort is interpreted even in the absence of others. In early human environments, this social dimension would have played a significant role in survival. Individuals rarely acted alone for extended periods. Movement, foraging, and daily activity often took place within small groups where coordination mattered. If one person moved too far beyond the pace of others, it could create separation, increasing exposure to risk. If someone ignored signals that others respected, it could lead to decisions that placed both the individual and the group in difficulty. Because of this, learning from others was not simply a matter of imitation, but a way of aligning behavior with the conditions that supported group stability. The limits observed in others became part of how each person understood their own. This process did not require explicit instruction. It could occur through repeated exposure, through noticing when others paused, how they responded to discomfort, and how effort was distributed across shared tasks. Over time, these observations formed a kind of social baseline, a reference point against which personal experience was compared. If effort began to feel difficult earlier than what seemed typical within the group, it might be interpreted as a personal limitation. If it extended beyond what others appeared to do, it might feel unusual or unnecessary. In this way, the perception of limits became intertwined with social patterns, not only reflecting individual capacity, but also group behavior. In modern environments, this influence remains, though it often takes different forms. A person may not be moving through landscapes with a small group in the same way as early humans, but the tendency to compare remains present. Observations of others, whether direct or indirect, continue to shape expectations about what is possible or appropriate. This can narrow or expand the perceived range of effort. If others appear to stop early, the sense of limit may arise sooner. If others continue further, the same individual may find that their own perceived limit shifts outward. The body itself has not changed in these moments, but the interpretation of its signals has been influenced by comparison. This suggests that limits are not only biological or internal, but partly constructed through shared experience. The brain does not evaluate effort in a vacuum. It places that effort within a broader context that includes what others have done, what seems typical, and what feels aligned with the group. Throughout human history, this would have supported coordination and reduced risk. allowing individuals to adapt their behavior based on collective patterns, rather than relying solely on personal trial and error. Yet this same mechanism also introduces another layer of complexity. The signals that guide effort are filtered not only through prediction and memory, but also through social reference. And within that layered process, the feeling of reaching a limit can reflect not just what the body is capable of, but what the individual has learned to expect from themselves in relation to others, making the boundary less a fixed point and more a shared understanding that shifts with context. Once this social layer begins to shape perception, limits are no longer guided only by what the body signals, but also by what feels acceptable within a shared pattern of behavior. A person may begin an activity with a certain internal capacity, yet adjust their pace, their persistence, or even their willingness to continue based on how others appear to respond. This adjustment is often quiet and automatic. It does not feel like imitation, but like a natural sense of what is appropriate in that moment. If others around them slow down, the individual may feel their own effort becoming heavier, as if the signal to stop has arrived sooner. If others continue steadily, the same person may find that the feeling of effort remains more manageable, even though the body itself has not changed in any measurable way. This reveals that the perception of limits can be influenced by shared rhythm as much as by individual condition. In early human environments, this shared rhythm would have been closely tied to survival. Movement often required coordination, whether in traveling across terrain, gathering resources, or responding to changes in the environment. If one person moved too far ahead, separation could increase risk. If someone fell behind, it could slow the group or create vulnerability. Because of this, aligning effort with others was not only practical, but necessary. The limits that emerged within a group were not fixed boundaries of physical capacity, but negotiated patterns that allowed the group to function together. Individuals learned, often without explicit awareness, to adjust their own sense of effort in relation to these patterns. This meant that the feeling of reaching a limit could arise not only from internal signals, but from the need to remain within a shared pace. Over time, these patterns became internalized. Even when alone, a person might carry with them an implicit sense of how effort should unfold, shaped by previous experiences within a group. This can create a situation where limits feel personal, even though they are partly inherited from social context. A person may stop at a certain point not because the body has reached its edge, but because that point aligns with what has been learned as typical or appropriate. In modern life, where direct group coordination may be less constant, but observation remains frequent, this process continues in more subtle ways. People observe how others work, move, or respond to effort, and these observations form a background reference that shapes expectations. If the observed pattern suggests that effort should be limited or brief, the internal sense of limit may align with that pattern. If the observed pattern suggests persistence, the same signals may be interpreted as manageable rather than final. This does not require conscious comparison. It happens through repeated exposure to shared behaviors, which gradually influence how effort is felt and understood. This social shaping adds another layer to the gap between perceived and actual limits. The body's capacity remains its own, but the interpretation of its signals becomes intertwined with what has been seen and learned from others. In this way, limits are not only predicted by the brain and informed by past experience, but also adjusted through social context. The brain does not simply ask how much the body can do, it also asks, in a quieter way, how much is expected, how much is typical, and how much aligns with the patterns that have been observed over time. And within that process, the boundary of effort can shift, not because the body has changed, but because the frame through which effort is understood has been shaped by the presence of others, both past and present. Over longer periods of time, these shared patterns do more than influence individual moments of effort. They begin to form stable expectations about what a person believes is possible for themselves. What starts as observation gradually becomes internal reference, shaping how the brain predicts effort even before it begins. A person may approach an activity with a quiet assumption about how long it will last, how difficult it will feel, and at what point it should end. These assumptions are not always based on direct experience. They are often built from repeated exposure to how others behave, what appears normal within a group, and what has been reinforced over time as acceptable or expected. In this way, social patterns do not only affect behavior during effort, they shape the starting point from which effort is interpreted. In early human environments, this kind of shared expectation would have helped maintain group cohesion. Individuals who aligned their behavior with group patterns could move, rest, and act in ways that supported collective survival. If effort was consistently distributed in a certain way within a group, those patterns would become familiar, and familiarity would shape expectation. A person would not need to test the full range of their capacity in order to function effectively. They could rely on learned patterns, conserving energy and reducing risk by staying within what had already proven workable in the group. This meant that limits were not discovered through constant exploration of maximum ability, but through alignment with established patterns that balanced effort and safety over time. Over generations, this process would reinforce itself, making social expectations a quiet but persistent influence on how limits were perceived. In modern environments, where individuals often act outside of immediate group coordination but remain surrounded by social information, this influence continues in a more distributed form. People observe others across many contexts, through direct interaction or indirect exposure, and these observations contribute to a background sense of what is typical. This background does not remain separate from personal experience. It becomes part of how the brain predicts effort, shaping how difficult something is expected to feel and how long it is expected to be sustained. When effort begins, these expectations can guide interpretation. If the experience matches what has been observed, the activity may feel aligned and manageable. If it differs, the same physical signals may feel more difficult or more uncertain, even if the body is capable of continuing. This can lead to a narrowing of perceived limits, where individuals remain within a range that reflects learned patterns rather than actual capacity. The body may hold more ability than is being used, but the expectation of where effort should end can make continuation feel unnecessary or even inappropriate. At the same time, when expectations shift, when a person is exposed to different patterns of effort, the perceived boundary can expand without any fundamental change in the body itself. This suggests that limits are not only shaped by biological systems and immediate perception, but also by long-term exposure to shared behaviors that define what seems normal. Throughout human history, this would have allowed individuals to function effectively within groups without needing to constantly test the extremes of their ability. It reduced risk and conserved energy by aligning behavior with patterns that had already proven sustainable. Yet it also means that the sense of a personal limit is not entirely personal. It carries traces of the social environments in which it was formed. When a person feels that they have reached the end of what they can do, part of that feeling may come from the body, part from prediction, and part from expectations shaped by others. And within that mixture, the boundary that feels so clear in the moment may reflect not only what is possible, but what has been learned as enough. In modern environments, something subtle but important has changed in the way limits are experienced. The body and brain still operate using systems shaped in conditions of uncertainty, yet the environment in which those systems now function often provides far fewer natural signals to guide interpretation. In early human life, effort was closely tied to visible and tangible conditions. Movement happened across terrain that could be felt underfoot, distance could be sensed through changing surroundings, and the need to continue or stop was often linked to immediate environmental cues. The body did not have to rely only on internal signals, because the external world offered continuous feedback about what was happening and what might be required next. This external feedback helped calibrate the internal sense of effort, keeping perception connected to real conditions rather than isolated within the body alone. In contrast, many modern activities take place in environments that are stable, repetitive, and largely disconnected from natural variation. Movement may occur on flat, predictable surfaces, tasks may be performed in controlled spaces, and effort may be applied without clear changes in the surrounding environment. In these settings, the body receives fewer external cues that would normally help interpret internal signals. As a result, the brain must rely more heavily on its own predictions and past patterns to determine how effort should be felt and when it should stop. This shift increases the influence of internal interpretation, making the perception of limits more dependent on expectation than on direct environmental feedback. When external signals are reduced, the internal system does not become more precise. It becomes more dominant. The brain continues to generate predictions based on patterns shaped in earlier environments, but without the same level of real-time correction from the outside world. This can lead to situations where the sense of effort rises or falls in ways that feel disconnected from the actual demands of the task. A person may feel a strong sense of limitation during an activity that carries little real risk, simply because the internal system is operating without the balancing influence of external feedback. At the same time, the absence of natural cues can make it more difficult to recognize when effort could safely continue. The body is still capable of more, but the signals that would normally support that continuation are less visible. This creates a quiet imbalance. The internal system, shaped by uncertainty, continues to signal caution, while the environment no longer provides the same level of information to adjust or refine that signal. Over time, this imbalance can make limits feel more rigid than they actually are. The brain, lacking clear external reference points, may treat its own predictions as more definitive than they were ever intended to be. In early human environments, this would have been less likely to occur, because the external world constantly interacted with perception. Changes in terrain, temperature, distance, and resource availability all contributed to how effort was understood. The body did not operate in isolation. It was part of a continuous exchange with the environment, and that exchange helped keep the perception of limits flexible and responsive. In modern settings, where many of these variations are reduced, the system remains the same, but its context has changed. The body still expects uncertainty, still prepares for unpredictable demands, and still signals caution in advance. Yet without the same environmental feedback to balance those signals, the feeling of reaching a limit can appear earlier and feel more absolute than it might have in the conditions where the system originally developed. And within this quieter, more controlled world, humans often interpret these internal signals as precise reflections of their ability, even though they are now operating without many of the external references that once helped define what those signals truly meant. When natural feedback from the environment becomes limited, the brain does not remain neutral. It begins to fill the gap with its own internal references, drawing more heavily on expectation, memory, and prediction to guide behavior. In early human life, this substitution would have been less necessary, because the world itself provided continuous signals that helped shape perception. The body could feel changes in terrain, sense shifts in temperature, notice variations in light, and respond to the presence or absence of resources. These external cues worked together with internal sensations, creating a balance between what was felt inside and what was observed outside. In that balance, the perception of effort remained connected to a broader reality. In modern environments, however, many of these cues are reduced or removed. Tasks may take place in spaces where the surroundings change very little, where distance does not unfold gradually, and where effort is applied in ways that are disconnected from visible outcomes. In such conditions, the brain receives less information from the outside world to guide its interpretation. As a result, it leans more heavily on internal models, using past patterns and expectations to estimate what is happening and what might happen next. This reliance on internal prediction is not a flaw. It is the same process that allowed humans to function in uncertain environments. But without the balancing influence of external feedback, these predictions can become more dominant than they were ever intended to be. This dominance can shape the experience of limits in subtle but consistent ways. When the brain relies more on prediction, it may begin to treat its own estimates as if they were direct observations. The feeling of effort, already influenced by caution and past experience, can take on a stronger sense of certainty. A person may feel that they have reached a limit not because the body has fully expressed its capacity, but because the internal model suggests that continuing would be costly or unnecessary. Without clear external signals to challenge or refine that model, the perception can remain untested, reinforcing itself over time. This can lead to a narrowing of perceived limits, where the range of effort that feels possible becomes smaller than what the body could actually sustain. In early human environments, such narrowing would have been less stable, because the external world would constantly provide new information that could adjust perception. A longer path than expected, a change in conditions, or the need to respond to an unexpected event could shift the sense of what was required, encouraging the body to extend effort beyond its initial estimate. In modern settings where many activities follow predictable patterns and lack such variation, the opportunity for this kind of adjustment is reduced. The internal model may remain unchallenged, and the perceived limit may settle into a fixed position, even though the underlying capacity remains flexible. This creates a situation where the body's ability and the mind's expectation gradually drift apart. The body continues to hold a range of potential responses shaped by its biological structure, while the mind operates within a narrower set of predictions shaped by repeated, controlled conditions. Over time, this drift can make limits feel more defined than they actually are. The boundary appears stable, not because it has been precisely measured, but because it has been repeatedly reinforced by an environment that does not provide enough variation to test it. This does not mean that modern environments reduce human capacity. Rather, they change how that capacity is perceived and accessed. The system that interprets effort remains the same, but the context in which it operates no longer offers the same level of feedback. As a result, the feeling of reaching a limit becomes more dependent on internal expectation than on direct interaction with the world, and within that dependence, humans may come to trust their perception of limits as fixed, even though it continues to be shaped by a system that was never designed to produce exact boundaries in the first place. When this reliance on internal prediction continues without enough variation to adjust it, the perception of limits can begin to settle into patterns that feel stable, even though the underlying system remains flexible. The brain does not actively seek to test these patterns unless the environment provides a reason to do so. In early human life, such reasons were frequent. Conditions changed, demands shifted, and the body was often required to respond in ways that extended beyond what had been expected at the beginning of an activity. These moments of extension, where effort continued further than initially anticipated, would have helped recalibrate the internal sense of what was possible. The system remained cautious, but it was also continuously updated by real interaction with an unpredictable world. In modern environments, where many activities follow consistent structures and predictable outcomes, this process of recalibration can become less frequent. The brain forms an expectation about how effort should feel and when it should end, and because the environment often confirms that expectation, the pattern becomes reinforced. Over time, the perceived limit can begin to feel fixed, not because it represents a true boundary, but because it has been repeated without interruption. The body may still hold the ability to go further, but without situations that require or reveal that extension, the internal model remains unchanged. This creates a quiet form of narrowing, where the range of what feels possible becomes smaller than the range of what is biologically available. The body is still capable of adapting, but the perception of that adaptability becomes less accessible. This effect can be understood by considering how rarely the modern environment demands unexpected continuation. Many tasks have defined durations, clear endpoints, and predictable levels of effort. Once those endpoints are reached, activity stops, and there is little reason to explore beyond them. The body is not placed in situations where it must discover whether it can continue further, because the environment does not require that discovery. As a result, the brain does not receive the information needed to adjust its predictions. The perceived limit remains where it was last confirmed, even if that confirmation occurred under conditions that did not fully reflect the body's capacity. In early human environments, this would have been less likely to occur, because the world itself would have introduced variation. A task might take longer than expected, a path might extend further, or a situation might require continued effort despite initial signals to stop. These experiences would have provided natural opportunities for the system to update, keeping the perception of limits aligned with the body's actual ability. Without such variation, the system becomes more dependent on its own past predictions, and those predictions can gradually define what feels possible. This does not mean that the body has lost its capacity, but that the pathway to accessing that capacity has become less visible. The signals that once encouraged exploration beyond expectation are quieter, while the signals that reinforce stopping remain clear and consistent. Over time, this imbalance can make limits feel more certain than they truly are. A person may come to trust the feeling of stopping as a final point, not because it has been tested against the full range of ability, but because it has rarely been challenged. And within this pattern, the modern environment does not create false limits, but it allows untested limits to become stable, shaping perception in a way that reflects repetition more than reality, leaving the boundary of what is possible defined not by the body itself, but by the conditions under which that body has been repeatedly used. There is a quiet assumption that often goes unnoticed, the idea that each person has a fixed limit, a stable boundary that defines what they can and cannot do. This assumption feels natural because the experience of stopping often appears consistent. A person may reach a similar point of fatigue in repeated situations and begin to treat that point as a reliable marker of their capacity. Over time, this repeated experience can create the impression that the limit itself is stable, something that belongs to the body in a fixed way. Yet when examined more carefully, this sense of stability begins to reveal a different structure. What appears to be a fixed limit is often the result of repeated conditions producing similar perceptions, not a direct reflection of an unchanging boundary within the body. The human organism does not operate with a single, permanent edge of ability. Its capacity shifts continuously, influenced by internal state, environmental conditions, and the way effort is interpreted in each moment. In early human environments, this variability would have been unavoidable. No 2 days were the same. Energy levels changed depending on food availability, rest was affected by safety and weather, and physical demands varied with terrain and necessity. Because of this, the body could not rely on a fixed reference point for what it was capable of. Instead, it had to remain adaptable, adjusting its output and its perception of effort according to changing circumstances. The idea of a stable limit would not have been useful in such a setting, because the conditions that defined effort were constantly shifting. Over time, this adaptability became part of how the body regulated itself. The perception of limits was not anchored to a single point, but recalculated based on current signals and broader context. In modern environments, however, many conditions become more consistent. Tasks are repeated in similar ways, environments remain stable, and the demands placed on the body often follow predictable patterns. This consistency can create the appearance of a fixed limit, because the same conditions tend to produce similar experiences. When a person encounters the same level of difficulty at roughly the same point across repeated activities, it becomes natural to interpret that point as a boundary that does not change. Yet this interpretation overlooks the underlying variability that still exists within the body. Even in controlled settings, capacity is not constant. It can vary with subtle changes in rest, attention, motivation, and countless other factors that are not always immediately visible. What remains consistent is not the limit itself, but the pattern of experience shaped by repeated conditions. This distinction is important because it reveals how easily perception can be mistaken for structure. The feeling of a stable limit does not necessarily indicate that the body has a fixed boundary. It may instead reflect the stability of the environment in which that feeling occurs. If conditions rarely change, the signals that arise within those conditions will also tend to repeat, reinforcing the sense of constancy. In early human life, where variation was constant, such reinforcement would have been less likely. The body would have encountered a wider range of experiences, making it more difficult for a single perception to become fixed as a definition of capacity. In modern life, where variation can be reduced, the opposite becomes possible. A narrow range of repeated experiences can give rise to a strong sense of a fixed limit, even though the underlying system remains flexible. This creates a subtle form of misinterpretation. The body continues to adjust and adapt, but the mind begins to treat its signals as stable indicators of ability. Over time, this can make limits feel more certain than they are, not because they have been precisely defined, but because they have been consistently experienced under similar conditions, leading humans to believe that what feels the same must remain the same, even when the body itself continues to change beneath that perception. This impression of a fixed limit becomes even more convincing when the body repeatedly encounters similar conditions over long stretches of time. When the same activity is performed in the same way, at similar times of day, with similar levels of rest and similar expectations, the signals that arise during that activity begin to follow a familiar pattern. The point at which effort starts to feel heavy, the moment when continuation begins to feel uncertain, and the stage at which stopping seems appropriate can all appear with a quiet regularity. Because this pattern repeats, it creates the sense that the limit itself is stable, as if it were built into the body in a fixed and measurable way. Yet what is actually stable is not the limit, but the conditions that produce the experience of that limit. The body, beneath this repeated pattern, continues to change from moment to moment, adjusting to variations that may be too subtle to notice directly. In early human environments, such stability would have been rare. Daily life unfolded under conditions that changed continuously. sometimes in small ways, sometimes in more pronounced ones. Food availability varied. Rest was influenced by safety and temperature, and movement depended on terrain that was rarely uniform. Because of this, the body encountered a wide range of demands, and the perception of effort had to adjust accordingly. A task that felt difficult on one day might feel manageable on another, not because the body had fundamentally changed, but because the surrounding conditions had shifted. Over time, this variability would have made it difficult for any single perception of a limit to become fixed. Instead, limits would have been experienced as fluid, responding to the interplay between internal state and external demands. In modern environments, where repetition and control are more common, this fluidity can become less visible. The same activity performed under similar conditions produces similar sensations, and these sensations begin to define expectation. The brain, always seeking patterns, uses these repeated experiences to form a model of what is possible. This model is not based on the full range of the body's capacity, but on the subset of experiences that have been most consistently encountered. As a result, the perceived limit becomes anchored to a narrow band of conditions, even though the body itself remains capable of operating beyond that band under different circumstances. This anchoring can be subtle, but its effects are significant. It can make the boundary of effort feel more precise than it actually is, reducing the sense of variability that still exists beneath the surface. A person may come to believe that they always reach a limit at a certain point, without recognizing that this point has been defined by repetition rather than by true capacity. This belief can then influence future perception, reinforcing the same pattern. When effort begins, the brain anticipates the familiar sequence of sensations, and those sensations appear in alignment with expectation. The experience confirms the model, and the model continues to guide perception. In this way, the impression of a fixed limit becomes self-reinforcing. It is not that the body cannot go further, but that the conditions under which it is used rarely require or reveal that possibility. In early human life, where variation was constant, this kind of reinforcement would have been less stable. The environment itself would have interrupted patterns, forcing the body to adapt and the brain to update its expectations. In modern settings, where patterns can persist without interruption, the opportunity for such updating becomes less frequent. The body remains adaptable, but the perception of that adaptability becomes less accessible. And within this quiet repetition, humans begin to trust the feeling of a fixed limit, not because it has been fully tested, but because it has been consistently experienced under conditions that rarely change, allowing perception to stand in for reality even when the underlying capacity continues to shift. When a pattern of effort is repeated often enough, it begins to feel not only familiar, but inevitable. The body moves through the same sequence of sensations, and the mind learns to expect each stage before it fully arrives. This expectation does not remain passive. It begins to shape the experience itself, guiding how signals are interpreted from the very beginning of an activity. A person may start with an unspoken sense of how long they will continue, when the effort will become difficult, and at what point stopping will feel appropriate. These expectations are rarely questioned, because they feel consistent with past experience. Yet they are built on repetition, not on a complete exploration of what the body can do. In early human environments, such fixed expectations would have been difficult to maintain. The conditions that shaped effort were too variable to support a stable sequence. A journey might extend further than expected, a search might require more persistence, or a situation might demand continued effort despite initial signs of fatigue. These moments would have disrupted any simple pattern, forcing the brain to adjust its predictions and allowing the perception of limits to remain flexible. The body did not rely on a single expectation of how effort would unfold. It adapted to what was required, even when that requirement exceeded what had been experienced before. In modern environments, where many tasks are structured and predictable, this flexibility can become less active. The same sequence of effort is repeated, and the expectation becomes more precise. The brain begins to treat the familiar pattern as a reliable guide, shaping perception so that the experience aligns with what is expected. When effort begins to rise, the mind may interpret this increase as the approach of a known limit, even if the body still holds additional capacity. The sensation feels accurate because it matches the pattern that has been learned. Over time, this process can narrow the range of what feels possible. The body remains capable of adapting to new demands, but the perception of those demands becomes constrained by expectation. A person may stop at a certain point not because continuation is impossible, but because it falls outside the pattern that has been reinforced. The limit becomes less a discovery of capacity and more a confirmation of expectation. This creates a quiet loop. Experience shapes expectation, expectation shapes perception, and perception reinforces the same experience. Within this loop, the boundary of effort appears stable, even though it has not been tested against the full range of what the body can do. In early human life, the environment itself would have interrupted this loop, introducing variation that required adjustment. In modern life, where repetition can continue without interruption, the loop can persist, allowing the impression of a fixed limit to deepen over time. This does not mean that the body has lost its ability to extend beyond familiar patterns. It means that the pathway to that extension is less frequently used. The signals that once encouraged adaptation are still present, but they are filtered through expectations that favor consistency. As a result, the feeling of reaching a limit becomes more certain than the reality it represents. It reflects a history of repeated experiences rather than the full capacity of the body in the present moment. And within this certainty, humans often misinterpret their own limits, treating a familiar stopping point as a final boundary, when it may only be the edge of what has been repeatedly practiced, not the edge of what remains possible beyond it. What people call fatigue often feels like a conclusion, as if the body has delivered its final answer and there is nothing left to discuss. But in many cases, fatigue is better understood as a negotiation that unfolds over time rather than a simple sign of failure. The sensation does not appear all at once, and it does not emerge from one single source. It builds through changing signals from the body, changing predictions in the brain, and a shifting judgment about whether continuing is worth the cost. This is why the same activity can feel impossible in one moment and manageable in another, even when the body itself has not changed in any dramatic way. The feeling of fatigue is not only about what has already been spent, it is also about what the brain believes should still be protected. In early human environments, this would have been essential. A person moving across uncertain ground, carrying food, watching the weather, and remaining alert to danger could not afford to treat tiredness as a simple mechanical outcome. What mattered was not merely how much energy had been used, but how much needed to remain available for what might happen next. Under those conditions, fatigue worked as a way of slowing action before the body entered a state that might be hard to recover from. It was not a declaration that the body had failed. It was a pressure toward adjustment, a signal asking whether the present effort should continue at the same level, be reduced, or be paused for the sake of future survival. That is why fatigue often changes when context changes. If the endpoint becomes clearer, if the surroundings feel safer, or if attention shifts away from discomfort, the same body may suddenly feel more capable. This does not mean the earlier fatigue was false. It means the negotiation has changed. The brain has revised its estimate of cost and necessity, and the body's signals are being interpreted through a new situation. In this sense, fatigue behaves less like a wall and more like an argument inside the organism, one side urging conservation, the other allowing continuation when the conditions seem acceptable. Modern people often misunderstand this because they expect fatigue to act like a precise meter. They assume that when tiredness appears, it is reporting the exact state of the body, as if it were measuring a fixed reserve that is nearly gone. But the human body did not evolve in a world that rewarded such exactness. It evolved in a world of uncertainty, where it was safer to begin negotiating earlier rather than later. A person who reduced effort before true exhaustion would more often preserve enough capacity for cold, hunger, distance, or unexpected movement later in the day. Because of this, fatigue became part warning, part prediction, and part regulation. It tells the body to reconsider, not always to stop. This is why humans so often misread their own limits. They mistake the opening of the negotiation for the end of the story. They treat the first serious feeling of tiredness as proof that capacity is nearly finished, when in many situations it may only mean that the brain has started protecting a margin it does not want to lose. The body is not giving a final answer at that point. It is beginning a conversation shaped by a very old world, one in which survival depended not on using every last reserve in the present moment, but on preserving enough to remain capable when the next demand arrived, whether seen or unseen. When fatigue is understood as a negotiation, it becomes possible to notice that it does not move in a straight line. It rises, pauses, and sometimes recedes, even when the body continues to work. This pattern can feel confusing if fatigue is expected to increase steadily until a final limit is reached. But in practice, the sensation often shifts in response to changing interpretations rather than purely physical depletion. A person may feel a strong urge to stop, then after a brief adjustment in pace or attention, find that the same activity becomes manageable again. The body has not suddenly regained lost energy. Instead, the terms of the negotiation have changed, allowing continuation under slightly different conditions. In early human environments, this flexibility would have been necessary. Effort rarely unfolded in a single, continuous block. Movement could slow when terrain became difficult, increase when conditions improved, and pause when resources were found or when safety required stillness. The body needed to adapt not only to how much effort was being used, but to how that effort was distributed across time. Fatigue, in this context, functioned as a guide for adjusting behavior rather than a fixed endpoint. It signaled when the current level of effort might be too costly, but it also allowed for continuation if the situation shifted in a way that reduced risk. This is why fatigue can feel different depending on how an activity is approached. A steady, unchanging pace may bring the sensation of tiredness earlier, while a pace that adjusts in small ways can allow the same activity to continue longer without a strong sense of limitation. The difference is not always in the body's capacity, but in how that capacity is being managed. When effort is varied, the brain may interpret the situation as more sustainable, reducing the urgency of the signal. When effort is constant and unchanging, the same signals may be interpreted as a reason to stop sooner. This reflects a system that is sensitive not only to how much energy is being used, but to how flexible that use appears to be over time. In modern environments where many activities are structured and repetitive, this aspect of fatigue can be less visible. Tasks often follow fixed patterns, with less variation in pace or demand. As a result, the sensation of fatigue may appear more linear, giving the impression that it is directly tied to depletion. Yet even in these settings, small changes in context can alter the experience. A shift in attention, a change in surroundings, or a clearer sense of how long the activity will last can influence how fatigue is felt. These changes do not necessarily increase the body's energy, but they can alter the brain's interpretation of the situation, allowing the negotiation to continue. This suggests that fatigue is not a single signal pointing to a single boundary. It is a dynamic process, shaped by ongoing evaluation of cost, risk, and necessity. The body and brain are not simply measuring what has been used. They are continuously asking whether continuing is still a reasonable choice. When that judgment changes, the feeling of fatigue can change with it, even if the physical state of the body remains similar. This does not mean that limits do not exist, but that the path to those limits is not fixed. It moves with context, with interpretation, and with the shifting balance between conserving and continuing. And within this movement, the experience of fatigue becomes less like a final answer and more like a conversation that unfolds over time, often beginning earlier than expected, and sometimes continuing further than it first appears possible. When fatigue is seen as a negotiation rather than a fixed endpoint, another pattern becomes visible. The outcome of that negotiation is not decided in a single moment, but shaped gradually by how the situation continues to unfold. The first strong signal of tiredness does not close the process. It opens it. What follows depends on how the body and brain continue to evaluate the balance between effort and necessity. If the situation remains uncertain, if the future feels unclear or demanding, the signal may strengthen, pushing towards stopping in order to preserve a margin of safety. If the situation becomes more predictable, if the end point is understood or the environment feels stable, the same signal may soften, allowing continuation even though the body has not recovered in any measurable way. This shifting outcome reflects a system that is constantly reassessing, rather than committing to a final judgment. In early human environments, this ongoing reassessment would have been essential. A person moving through a landscape could not rely on a single decision about effort. Conditions could change quickly, requiring adjustments in pace, direction, or intensity. A path that seemed manageable could become more difficult, or a search that appeared unproductive could suddenly succeed. Because of this, the body needed to remain responsive, not only to its internal state, but to the unfolding environment. Fatigue, in this context, functioned as a flexible signal that could be strengthened or reduced depending on what the situation required. It did not mark the end of capacity. It guided how capacity should be used in relation to changing conditions. This flexibility can still be observed in modern life, though it is often less visible. A person may begin an activity and feel a strong sense of limitation early on, yet as the activity continues, that sense may shift. The body does not suddenly gain new energy, but the interpretation of effort changes as the brain gathers more information about what is actually required. When the unknown becomes known, when uncertainty is reduced, the need for caution may decrease, and the negotiation may move toward continuation rather than stopping. This is why effort sometimes feels hardest at the beginning or at points of transition, when the brain has less information to work with and relies more heavily on protective prediction. At the same time, there are situations where fatigue intensifies even without a clear increase in physical demand. This often occurs when the brain interprets the situation as uncertain, prolonged, or difficult to recover from. The body may be capable of continuing, but the negotiation shifts toward conservation because the future appears less secure. This pattern reflects the same principle that shaped human perception over long periods of time. When outcomes are uncertain, it is safer to protect capacity than to risk using it fully. The feeling of fatigue becomes stronger not because the body has reached its limit, but because the brain is increasing its caution. This dynamic reveals something important about how humans misinterpret their limits. They often treat fatigue as a fixed signal, assuming that once it appears strongly, the boundary has been reached. But in reality, fatigue is part of a process that can move in different directions depending on how the situation is understood. The body is not simply running out of energy. It is adjusting its use of energy based on prediction, context, and expectation. This adjustment continues even after the sensation of tiredness becomes noticeable, meaning that the initial feeling does not determine the final outcome. When viewed through this lens, the idea of a limit becomes less like a single point and more like the result of an ongoing dialogue within the body. The brain and body are not announcing a final boundary. They are continuously negotiating where that boundary should be placed in relation to the conditions at hand. In early human life, this dialogue would have allowed for survival in environments where certainty was rare and demands could change without warning. In modern life, the same dialogue continues, even when the conditions no longer require the same level of caution. And within that dialogue, what feels like the end of ability may often be only the moment when the negotiation becomes most noticeable, not the moment when capacity is truly exhausted. If fatigue is not a final answer but a negotiation, then there must also be moments when that negotiation shifts in the opposite direction, when the signals that usually encourage stopping become quieter, and the body continues further than expected. These moments can feel surprising, as if a hidden reserve has suddenly appeared, allowing effort to extend beyond what previously seemed possible. Yet this extension is not the creation of new capacity. It is the release of capacity that was already present but not being used under earlier conditions. The system that usually protects by signaling caution can, under certain circumstances, reduce that caution, allowing the body to move closer to its actual limits. In early human environments, this ability to continue beyond initial signals would have been just as important as the tendency to stop early. There were situations where stopping too soon could carry its own risks. If a person needed to reach shelter before darkness, escape a dangerous situation, or take advantage of a brief opportunity to secure resources, the cost of stopping early might outweigh the cost of continuing. In such cases, the brain would need to adjust its interpretation of effort, allowing continuation even when fatigue or discomfort was present. This does not mean that the protective system was turned off. It means that the balance between caution and continuation was shifted in response to the situation. The signals of fatigue might still exist, but they would be interpreted differently, becoming something that could be tolerated rather than something that required immediate stopping. This shift reveals that limits are not only about how the body signals caution, but also about when that caution is reduced. The same system that produces early warnings can also allow those warnings to be set aside when the context demands it. In modern life, this pattern can still be observed, though it may appear less clearly because the situations that require such adjustment are less frequent. A person may feel unable to continue an activity, only to find that under different conditions, such as increased urgency, stronger focus, or a clearer endpoint, they are able to continue further than expected. The body has not changed in a fundamental way between these moments. What has changed is the interpretation of its signals. The brain has adjusted the balance between protection and continuation, allowing more of the body's capacity to be used. This suggests that the limits people experience are not simply imposed by the body, but actively managed by a system that weighs multiple factors at once. When the perceived cost of stopping becomes higher than the cost of continuing, the system can shift, reducing the intensity of fatigue and allowing effort to extend. This does not remove the existence of true limits, but it changes how close a person is allowed to approach them. In early human life, this flexibility would have increased the chances of survival in situations where timing and response mattered. The body could conserve energy when uncertainty was high and extend effort when the situation required it, even if that meant moving closer to exhaustion. In modern environments, where such extremes are less common, the same system continues to operate in quieter ways. People may occasionally encounter moments where they exceed what they believe to be their limit, not because the limit has changed, but because the system that governs access to that limit has shifted. And within this shifting process, it becomes clear that what feels like a boundary is not always a fixed edge, but a point determined by how the brain interprets the situation, sometimes holding back, and at other times allowing the body to move further than it first appeared possible. There are also moments when the opposite pattern becomes dangerous, when the brain does not simply allow effort to continue a little further, but permits the body to move so far beyond ordinary warning signals that recovery becomes more difficult afterward. These moments matter because they reveal another side of human misinterpretation. People do not only mistake early caution for a final limit. Sometimes they mistake reduced warning for proof that no real limit is near. In those situations, the body may continue not because risk has disappeared, but because the system that usually emphasizes protection has temporarily changed its priorities. The same mechanism that can make fatigue feel early and restrictive can, under different conditions, become quieter and allow more of the body's reserves to be used. In early human environments, this would have been useful in narrow and specific circumstances. A person escaping danger, reaching shelter, or responding to an urgent need could not always stop when discomfort first appeared. There were moments when continuation was more important than conservation, and the brain had to adjust accordingly. Under those conditions, the protective system did not vanish, but it lowered its immediate pressure, allowing the body to keep moving despite signals that would otherwise encourage stopping. This ability would have increased survival when the cost of stopping was greater than the cost of continuing, but the same flexibility also carried risk. If warning signals could be softened when urgency was high, then the body could be brought closer to real exhaustion or strain without the usual experience of strong internal resistance. In that sense, reduced warning does not necessarily mean greater safety. It can simply mean that the brain has judged the present demand to be more important than conserving capacity for later. This distinction is easy to miss because the subjective experience changes so much. When fatigue feels quieter, people often assume the body is handling the situation well, yet what may actually be happening is that interpretation has shifted, not capacity itself. The body may still be approaching a point where further continuation becomes costly, but the sensation of that cost is being delayed or reduced. In modern life, this pattern can appear in quieter forms. A person may continue working, moving, or focusing far beyond what usually feels manageable because attention is narrowed, urgency is high, or the endpoint seems close enough to justify continued effort. In these moments, the perception of limit changes. Signals that would normally feel decisive become less persuasive, and continuation seems natural, even obvious. Only afterward does the cost become more visible, when the body begins to reveal what the reduced warning had temporarily hidden. This does not mean the body was deceiving the person. It means the system was prioritizing one need over another, allowing present demands to outweigh immediate protection. Throughout human history, such reweighting would have made sense in environments where timing mattered and delay could carry serious consequences. But it also means that the feeling of capability in a given moment cannot always be trusted as a direct measure of safety. Humans misinterpret their own limits in both directions. They may stop too early when caution dominates, and they may continue too far when caution recedes. In both cases, the confusion comes from treating subjective experience as if it were a perfect map of bodily reality. Yet the experience is always filtered through a system designed for survival, in uncertain conditions, not for exact honesty about where the final boundary lies. And when that system decides, even briefly, that continuation matters more than restraint, the silence of warning can be just as misleading as its early arrival. When these two patterns are placed side by side, stopping too early and continuing too far, a deeper structure begins to appear. The system that shapes human limits is not designed to keep perception perfectly aligned with capacity. It is designed to adjust behavior under changing conditions, sometimes by increasing caution, and sometimes by reducing it. This means that the experience of a limit can shift in both directions, not because the body itself is inconsistent, but because the system that interprets it is constantly weighing different possibilities. At times, the brain emphasizes protection, bringing the sense of limit closer than necessary. At other times, it emphasizes continuation, allowing effort to extend beyond what would normally feel acceptable. Neither state is fully stable, and neither provides a complete picture of the body's true boundary. In early human environments, this flexibility would have been essential. Life did not present a single, consistent demand. It required both restraint and persistence, often within the same day. A person might need to conserve energy during uncertain conditions and then use that energy fully when an opportunity or risk appeared. Because of this, the system that regulated effort could not rely on a single rule. It had to remain responsive, adjusting its signals based on how the situation was understood at each moment. This created a range within which limits could move, expanding or contracting depending on the balance between caution and necessity. Over time, this range became part of how humans experienced effort, even if it was not consciously recognized. In modern life, this range still exists, but it is often misunderstood. People tend to look for a single point that defines their limit, something stable and predictable that can be relied upon. When they stop early, they may believe they have reached that point. When they continue further than expected, they may believe they have suddenly increased their capacity. Yet in many cases, both experiences are expressions of the same underlying system. The body has not changed in a fundamental way between these moments. What has changed is the position of the perceived boundary within a flexible range. This misunderstanding leads to a common pattern. A person may treat their earliest experience of fatigue as their true limit, narrowing their sense of what is possible. At another time, they may push far beyond that point and assume that the earlier limit was entirely false. In reality, neither conclusion is complete. The early signal reflects a protective bias, while the extended effort reflects a temporary reduction in that bias. The true boundary of the body lies somewhere beyond the early signal, but not necessarily as far as the point reached under reduced caution. It exists within a range that is not directly visible, only approached through changing interpretations. This makes the idea of a fixed personal limit difficult to maintain. The body operates within a spectrum, not at a single edge, and the perception of that spectrum depends on how signals are interpreted at any given time. In early human life, this variability would have allowed individuals to adapt to unpredictable demands, conserving when necessary and extending when required. In modern environments, where conditions are more stable, the same variability can lead to confusion. Without frequent changes to reveal the full range, people may rely on a narrow set of experiences to define their limits, mistaking a moving boundary for a fixed line. And within that mistake, they begin to believe that their capacity is either smaller or larger than it truly is, when in fact it has always existed within a shifting space shaped by a system that was never meant to provide a single, permanent answer, but only to guide behavior through uncertainty. By the time a person begins to sense that their limits may not be fixed, another change becomes possible, not a sudden expansion of ability, but a quieter change in how that ability is understood. For most of the journey through this question, the body has appeared less like a machine with a clear boundary, and more like a living system shaped by uncertainty, memory, caution, and changing context. That realization does not remove limits, but it changes the meaning of them. A limit is no longer simply the first point where effort feels heavy, nor the furthest point reached under unusual pressure. It becomes something more difficult to name, a moving relationship between what the body can do, what the brain is trying to protect, and what the situation seems to require. In early human environments, this moving relationship would have been natural because life itself was not stable enough to support a single answer. The same body could be asked to conserve on one day and continue much further on the next. Food, weather, distance, injury, and the presence of others all change the meaning of effort. Under those conditions, a precise and permanent sense of one's own limits would have been less useful than a flexible one. What mattered was not discovering a final edge once and for all, but remaining responsive as conditions changed. In modern life, however, people often expect their limits to be clearer than they really are. They expect the body to tell the truth in a simple form, as if fatigue, discomfort, or hesitation were precise measurements rather than cautious interpretations. This expectation creates part of the misunderstanding. The body is still doing what it was shaped to do, protect capacity in an uncertain world, but the modern mind often asks it for a kind of certainty it was never designed to provide. Because of that, people can begin to mistrust themselves in the wrong way. They may see every early signal as weakness, or every extended effort as proof that all earlier signals were false. Yet neither view fully respects what the body is actually doing. The early signal is not always the truth of the limit, but neither is it meaningless. The later extension is not always the truth of the limit either, but neither is it an illusion. Both belong to the same ancient system, one trying to balance survival, preservation, and action, in a world that for most of human history could not be trusted to remain stable for long. To understand limits more accurately, then, is not to become certain about them, but to become more humble about what they are. The body is not offering a clean line. It is offering shifting information, shaped by a long evolutionary memory that still lives beneath modern conditions. And perhaps that is where the deeper value of this question rests. Humans may misinterpret their own limits not because they are broken and not because they are weak, but because they are listening to a system built for uncertainty while living in a world that keeps asking for precision. The old protective voice is still there, speaking in sensations, pauses, and hesitation, reminding the body to hold something back for what might come next. But if that voice was shaped by a world that no longer fully exists, then when we hear it and call it our limit, are we hearing the truth of our body, or only the echo of the ancient world that first taught us to stop? If limits are not fixed points but shifting relationships, then the question slowly changes from where the limit is to how the limit is being interpreted in each moment. This shift does not require new strength or new ability. It requires a different kind of attention, one that notices that the first signal of stopping is not the same as the final boundary of the body. Over long stretches of human history, this distinction would not have been expressed in words, but it would have been lived in experience. A person would feel the early rise of effort, slow down, adjust, continue, pause, and then continue again when conditions allowed. The body would not move in a single line toward exhaustion, but in a pattern of modulation, responding to terrain, to distance, to hunger, to the presence of others, and to the changing needs of the day. In that pattern, limits would not appear as fixed edges, but as signals that changed meaning depending on context. In modern life, where many activities are continuous and less varied, this pattern can become less visible. Effort often feels like something that should be sustained in a straight line, from beginning to end, without interruption. When the first strong signal of fatigue appears, it can feel like a failure to maintain that line, as if something has gone wrong. But from a longer perspective, what is happening is not a failure. It is the same ancient system doing what it has always done, introducing variation into effort so that the body does not move blindly toward exhaustion. The difficulty is that modern conditions often encourage people to interpret that variation as a problem rather than as information. They expect effort to feel stable, and when it does not, they assume they have reached a limit. Yet the body has never operated through perfect stability. It has always adjusted, rising and falling in its sense of effort, even when the overall direction of activity remains the same. This creates a quiet misunderstanding. People look for a single point that defines what they can do, but the body offers only shifting signals that must be interpreted in relation to context. When those signals are taken as final answers, limits appear smaller or larger than they truly are. When they are seen as part of a process, the picture becomes more open, but also less certain. This uncertainty is not a flaw. It reflects the conditions under which the human organism was shaped. For most of its history, certainty was not available. The body could not rely on exact measurements or stable predictions. It had to remain flexible, adjusting its behavior in response to incomplete information. That flexibility still exists, even if the environment has changed. And perhaps this is where the understanding of limits becomes less about control and more about recognition. The body is not hiding its true capacity, nor is it fully revealing it at once. It is offering signals that reflect a balance between what is possible and what is safe, a balance that shifts with each moment. When those signals are mistaken for precise boundaries, confusion arises. But when they are understood as part of an ongoing adjustment, the experience of limits becomes quieter, less absolute, and more connected to the conditions in which it appears. This does not lead to a clear answer about how far a person can go, and it was never meant to. It leads instead to a different kind of awareness, one that recognizes that the first feeling of stopping is not the end, and the furthest point reached is not the full truth. Between those two lies a range that cannot be fixed in advance, only approached through experience, shaped by a system that continues to speak in cautious signals, even in a world that no longer requires the same level of caution, leaving open a final question that remains without a clear resolution. When the body tells us to stop, are we reaching the edge of what we are, or only the point where an older version of ourselves learned to be careful? By the end of this quiet exploration, the idea of a limit no longer appears as a single line waiting to be discovered. It begins to feel more like a shifting boundary that is never fully visible, only approached through signals that were never designed to be exact. The body does not speak in precise measurements. It speaks in tendencies, in early warnings, in adjustments that reflect a long history of uncertainty. And within that language, what we often call a limit is only one moment in an ongoing process, not the final edge of what is possible. Across most of human history, this would not have been a problem. The world itself would have guided interpretation. Movement, weather, hunger, and time would have shaped how effort was used, creating natural variations that kept perception flexible. A person would not need to define their limit in a fixed way, because the environment would constantly reshape how that limit was experienced. In modern life, however, the environment has become quieter in its feedback, while the internal system remains unchanged. The body still prepares for uncertainty, still protects for a future that may not arrive, and still signals caution in advance. But without the same level of external variation, those signals can begin to feel more absolute than they truly are. What was once a flexible guide becomes something that appears fixed, simply because it is repeated under stable conditions. This is where the misunderstanding deepens. People often look for certainty in a system that was never built to provide it. They listen for a clear answer from sensations that were shaped to be cautious, not exact. And when that answer feels consistent, they begin to trust it as a final truth. Yet the body has not changed its nature. It is still adjusting, still predicting, still holding something back in case it is needed later. The signals that suggest stopping are not false, but they are incomplete. They represent a moment of caution, not the full extent of capacity. At the same time, the moments when effort extends further than expected are not complete truths either. They reveal what is possible under certain conditions, but they do not define a permanent boundary. Between these two experiences, stopping early and continuing further, there exists a range that cannot be fixed in advance. It can only be approached, and even then, it shifts with context, with state, and with interpretation. In early human environments, this shifting range would have been a natural part of survival. The body would conserve when needed, extend when required, and adjust continuously without needing a clear definition of its limits. In modern life, the same system continues, but the expectation of certainty remains, and it is within that expectation that humans begin to misinterpret themselves. They search for a stable answer where only a flexible process exists. They treat signals as conclusions and variation as inconsistency, when in fact both are part of the same design. Perhaps the most accurate way to understand limits is not to define them, but to recognize how they are formed. They emerge from a dialogue between body and brain, shaped by memory, expectation, environment, and time. They are not discovered once and held forever. They are revised, sometimes subtly, sometimes more noticeably, as conditions change. And when the body says that it has reached its limit, it may not be pointing to the edge of what it can do, but to the edge of what it is willing to risk in that moment. That distinction is easy to overlook, yet it carries the quiet weight of human history, because if the feeling of stopping is shaped by a world that demanded caution, and if that world is no longer fully present, then the boundary we feel so clearly may not be where our ability ends, but where our inherited sense of safety begins, leaving us with a final question that remains open, not to be answered quickly, but to be considered slowly. When we believe we have reached our limit, are we meeting the true edge of our body, or only the place where an ancient system is asking us to pause?